All right, why don't we get started and welcome everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jeremy Burton. I'm the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Boston. Thank you for joining us today in our ongoing speaker series. Our topic today is, and it's sort of a little hard to say, sort of spell it out, that we as Jews can't stop talking about anti-Semitism. Regular readers of our JCRC blog know that this is a bit of a passion of mine, that we as Jews need to be talking about anti-Semitism, even though we also believe it's not our job to fight it. And I think we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. In October, I wrote a piece for the Times of Israel about anti-Semitism and the attempted erasure of Jews from progressive spaces because of any support we have for the existence of a Jewish state of Israel, and how our progressive credentials are being called into question. And for organizations like JCRC with a broad agenda, it creates obstacles to addressing the priorities we care about and advocate for on behalf of the Jewish community, including our place in civil society writ large. So what is the role of the Jewish community in talking about anti-Semitism? How do we call out anti-Semitism effectively when we see it? And how do we stay resilient in spite of the persistent nature of it and, frankly, the rising tide of anti-Semitism in recent years? I'm very thrilled to welcome a friend and colleague, a true expert in this field, Dr. Rachel Fish, for this conversation and to help us answer these questions. I'm not going to read her entire, very extensive and accomplished biography. We'll include that in the chat. I will note that she is a celebrated academic with 20 years of experience in the field of Israel history, Zionist thought, and Middle East studies. And she is currently the co-founder and scholar warrior, that is her title, of the new organization Boundless, a nonprofit thinking and action tank that is reimagining Israel education and engagement in North America. So Rachel, I want to start here. I've had the pleasure of collaborating with you for many years. And we were just reminiscing about some of the many interesting conversations we've done over the years. But for our audience who might not know you, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up being immersed in a field that frankly many of us find stressful and anxiety producing, to say the least. And to put it simply, how do you become a scholar warrior? And how has your work evolved since your earliest days in this field?
Sure. So I appreciate being here, Jeremy, and to JCRC for inviting me to participate in this conversation with you. It's a really nice opportunity to gather again. How does one become a scholar warrior? Well, this is what I can tell you. It's not a job title I'm sure many aspire to, but it is definitely how I imagine myself and see myself. And what I mean by that is the following. I deeply believe that education matters. I deeply believe that history matters. And I think you have to know from where you come in order to understand the moment you are in and to think about the future. And in order to do that, I felt strongly for myself that I needed to be able to dive deeply into subject matters that are of intellectual interest and I think pressing matters for the Jewish people. And for me, that had to do with the study of Israel, Zionism, Jewish history, Middle East studies. And I'm actually not an expert academically on anti-Semitism at all. That's not the area of study I spent most of my time and energy. Of course, you study about it, but it's not my primary concentration and area of focus as an academic. And yet, of course, when you engage with the context and content that I discussed in that subject areas, anti-Semitism is part of the conversation. And for me, it was being able to teach at the highest possible level about those subjects. That was very important to me. So that meant pursuing a doctorate in the field of Zionist history and Israel studies at Brandeis University, which I did under incredible tutelage and encouragement from the right individuals. That all being said, because of where I grew up as a kid, literally, I found that I was an educator at a very young age, because I had to be able to articulate what made me different, why I believed what I believed, why the holidays we celebrated were different than the holidays the majority of the individuals celebrated around us. And so it makes you learn how to make ideas accessible and digestible to a much broader audience. So I found that I was, already very much in this process of education from a very young age. That then is coupled with my own DNA. And my own DNA is one in which, when there are real challenges, I find that I want to be deeply involved in those challenges, trying to address them in order to create positive and necessary change. And I'm not afraid of those challenges. And again, it's because of where I grew up and who my parents were and are. And that gave me, I think, the encouragement and courage to be able to be the warrior that I aspire to be when it comes to tackling these very difficult issues for the Jewish people. And I don't know what that says about me, but I like those challenges. So I don't feel that they're anxiety producing. They actually, for me, produce a moment in time in which I feel compelled to do something. And that's because of how I was raised, which when we came home with a challenge, my father would say to us, "What are you going to do about it?"
Thanks. And for our audience, I want to let people know that if people want to ask a question, they can put it in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will try to capture as many of them or collect them and sort of bring them into this conversation as we go along. I want to ask you, because I think, you just talked about where you came from. And I know for myself, I came from a place, I grew up in a very Jewish environment. I grew up in New York City in a very sort of almost safe space Jewishly. That is not to say that I didn't experience moments of anti-Semitism in my life. And I think this anxiety question, the reason I frame it that way, is not a personal lying awake at night with fear, although I definitely have some lying awake about this topic, but the anxiety we fear about something that's changing. And I want to stay with this sort of like, but what is changing? You've been in this work, I know, for quite some time, not just what you were describing growing up, but like in this work in different ways. I honestly can say that I did not imagine when I became a Jewish professional, and I own this, when I first entered Jewish communal work, I thought, 90% of my work would be like, how we're representing our social justice agenda, our liberal values in American life, that would be the civic space work we're doing as Jewish communal organizations. And we're still doing that work. But I also find much more of this, it's not incidental, the experience of anti-Semitism. And it's changed for us sort of how we literally spend our days. And I'm curious for you, how you see that change over time informing your own work specifically.
So in that respect, Jeremy, I think that this was always under the surface for me and my work. Because I was in the academy, for real, I saw what was happening in the university over the last 20 some years. And it became very clear to me that there was real detraction towards Judaism, Jews, and Israel, and supporters of Israel. And that was part of the cultural and political zeitgeist within the university. And we can talk about why that is. And I think we should talk about why that is. And you and I have, in other conversations talked about why that is. But the reason I say it matters is because these aren't ideas that started in May 2021. These aren't ideas that started even just 5 years ago. These are intellectual ideas that have been part of a larger orientation and framework that over time have gone way beyond an intellectual environment and have seeped into mainstream conversations, whether it's in the social justice space, whether it's in politics, whether it's in media, traditional or social media. And I don't think the majority of our community actually understands the impact of these ideas and how they have changed the discourse. But because of being in the university, I don't think I was at all surprised in some ways that there was a growing culture that was basically being sown, in terms of creating a fertile ground for hostility towards Jews. And I think these manifestations of Jew hatred, of anti-Semitism, have transformed over time. And I think for many American Jews, particularly growing up in the Northeast Corridor, it was actually quite easy and comfortable to be Jewish. And again, because of where I grew up, that wasn't my reality. So I understood what anti-Semitism looked like coming from the right. I understood what the KKK had intentions to do. I understood what traditional theological Christian framings of anti-Semitism meant and what those tropes meant. And it was then in the university that I then saw how this comes from the hard left. So in my mind, this has always been present. It's just been a question of, are we noticing it? Are we aware of it? And then are we able to actually think about how to address it and or educate about it?
Right. So is it, are we noticing it? I mean, like, there are some elements of this that are clearly a rising anti-Semitism in our society. It doesn't require us going through the list of all the synagogues that have literally been attacked, people who have died in recent years. Let's name it, mostly at the hands of white supremacists and far right characters, although notably an exception being, and I'm going to say prior to May of this year, when things really exploded in a lot of cities, the notable exception being in the New York area, where it was not coming from white supremacists, right? That was definitely clear, and anybody who was watching what was going on in New York could see that. There's clearly been a rise, say here in Massachusetts, in swastikas, anti-Semitic incidents in schools that are, as you said, tropes, and I kind of want to unpack that word. How has the rise of that other, is it a rise of another form of anti-Semitism? Or is it just that we're noticing, because you use the word noticing it. And like, for myself, I'll own in this, like, it was very troubling to me recently when I saw left-wing organizations in Boston going after public officials for even engaging with mainstream Jewish individuals and saying that there's like a Zionist conspiracy in Boston to influence public officials. And that troubled me. What was frankly more troubling to me was that other left-wing organizations who have some level of credibility rose to their defense when we criticize it. So like, I guess I have developed not an acceptance, but a tolerance in my sort of mental space for a certain kind of hostile far left, anything and everything make it about Israel in the worst possible framework. What was striking to me was that others then joined in their defense, and that nobody else spoke up. There was no allies rallied to the cause. But I also wonder whether that's just new or we're just noticing it in a social media era.
And let me just ask you before answering,
Sure.
Many of those, let's say more center to, center left organizations that you have relationships with and that know the work of JCRC, why were they silent in this regard for the Jews, and yet very willing and encouraged to speak up in support of those other leftist organizations?
Well, that's an interesting question, because a couple of people after I wrote about it reached out and were like, if I had known about it in real time, I would have said something. And I do think and I'm going to say this, like, there is an interesting critique of, do we tell people enough what is going on? This comes to the why we have to be talking about anti-Semitism, is that I think there are people who genuinely just have other things going on in their life. I mean, I don't put it on every single Christian minister who is an ally and in solidarity with us to be constantly monitoring the far corners of Twitter. So it's like, there is an element of, they've got their own things that they're dealing with. They have communities in crisis. They have congregations dealing with the economic and social and frankly, the physical impact of COVID right now. they're not getting up and looking at all this. And there's some element of reminding them. And I've noticed, like, I don't want to like even beat up on our work. It was striking to me last year when right before, is it last year now? Whatever it was, right before COVID just sort of like took over the discourse and our lives, when things were rising in New York, that here in Massachusetts, 1,000 Christian leaders came together and wrote a powerful letter denouncing anti-Semitism. And that didn't happen anywhere else in the country, only happened in Massachusetts. So I'm not lost on the fact that there's a lot of allyship, but I do think it sometimes takes us bringing it to people's attention, what we're experiencing.
That's right. And there's a natural tension in that, because just tactically, sometimes the more attention you shine on something, the more problematic it becomes, the more airtime it gets, the more you're engaging in defending or responding to, versus if you can marginalize it, give it less attention, work behind the scenes. And so there's always that real tension. But what I hear you saying that's really speaking to me is, what does it look like to be having these sort of one-to-one relationship engagement, retail engagement around this particular issue, so that decision makers, the influencers in those communities really understand what's at stake here and why we as the Jewish community need their support, so that it's not just the Jews alone, just like when it's any other form of hate. We say, right, if you're going to fight racism, it's not only up to people of color, right? If you're going to fight homophobia, it's not only for the LGBTQ plus community to do it. If you're going to deal with Islamophobia, it's not only for the Muslim, right? Meaning it requires humanity to get on board and recognize when there is this othering, it is also our responsibility, even when we are not part of that particular community. So part of the challenge that I see all the time in that particular realm is that there is a real lack of understanding of what anti-Semitism is, straight up, especially the younger you go. But there is this understanding in some ways that that's ancient history. And I'm saying ancient in quotes, right? Because they think of the Holocaust as ancient. And there's this sense of, oh, well, we do Holocaust studies, so we clearly know what anti-Semitism is, or we have a Holocaust curriculum. Now, totally necessary, 100% important, and alone not sufficient in terms of actually understanding anti-Semitism and the way it's transformed over time. I mean, some of the research that I was involved in looked at the question of what is anti-Semitism? And we asked 13 to 35-year-olds across the country, demographically representative. And Jeremy, it makes us laugh, because what we heard was, well, first of all, what's a Semite? Second of all, the question, the response to that question was, well, I'm anti-racist, I'm anti-homophobic, I'm anti-Islamophobic, so I'm probably an anti-Semite. And we're like, no, you're an anti-Semite, but the term itself isn't understood. And so therefore, that's where we have to help individuals understand what this is as a conspiracy theory, because it's not like all other forms of hate. There are similarities in terms of how it may manifest, in terms of the othering and the demonization and dehumanization. But it isn't just about being perceived as being inferior, which is what much of hate does. Rather, anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory. And as a conspiracy theory, it supposes that Jews are pulling the strings in ways that have outsized proportional influence to Jews, whether it's the weather, banks, media, whatever it is. But it is this deep-seated envy and resentment towards the Jews that continues to persist. And I am not one of these people who thinks you can get rid of anti-Semitism. I think it will continue to morph so that it stays relevant and is resonant, because there needs to be a scapegoat. So the question that I think about is, how do you ameliorate or mitigate that Jew hatred, rather than think about how do you get rid of it? Because I don't think that's realistic. And I think humans are who they are. And so envy and resentment will persist.
So, I appreciate I always appreciate everything you say. And I love listening to you talk about this stuff because it helps me figure out how I want to talk about this. I really appreciated when you talk about marginalizing. And I think that's one of the things I struggle with, that it feels like has changed over the last 20 or 30 years. And I often say that I think my generation, I'm not going to speak for you, but my generation of American Jews are ill prepared on a personal level for this fight, and maybe younger people will be better prepared, because I think, and I say this as someone who came of age like in the politics of the late 80s and the 90s, we sort of had this like, yay, we've defeated anti-Semitism, it's over. And sure, there are a couple of nut job extremists around someplace, you know, who are anti-Semitic, and we certainly had the occasional violent attack, but it felt very comfortable to be out and organized as Jews in a very public space, in government, in the media. You know, all the jokes that could be made about the Clinton administration, was he the first Jewish president, on many different levels. And now it feels like, oh, wait a second, it's not just marginal anymore. And I'm kind of curious, because I want to get into like that, how we help prepare members of our community, and what you say, because I know you talk about this stuff a lot. Like, I know that you talk to both parents and to their kids about this, and you do a lot of work with kids in the sort of the teen level and college age. Before we get to what you say to teens, like, let's talk about what you say to parents. Like, how do we, for people of my generation who are like basically going like, what the hell? How do you help us sort of grapple with this problem?
Yeah, so Jeremy, this is actually where I will say it's fascinating, because we are seeing very different generational experiences, just like you're saying. Because the generation of parents, particularly parents of teens and college aged kids, so let's say 50-ish in that range, age range, right, they are not the parents who experienced anti-Semitism in America, right? The generation. Maybe their parents did, maybe their grandparents did, but they themselves didn't. So they have been very comfortable in America. So that's one piece of this. The other piece of this is that, and not only for this generation, but for sure, this generation experienced thinking about Jewishness as a religion, and primarily as a religious identity. So when that happens, you don't necessarily think about anti-Semitism in these other manifestations when it's not targeting Judaism, but targeting other aspects of Jewish life. And that's a shift for some folks, because that peoplehood conversation, for example, and tribalism, and I'm not saying that in a pejorative way, in a positive way, like Jews as a people and as a tribe, that's not been part of the conversation within the American Jewish community for a very long time. And that generation of parents now has to figure out, okay, well, how do I make sense of that? And what does that then also mean when that identity of being Jew as a people and a religion is perceived as an extension of Israel and the collective Israeli identity and Israeli behavior? That is not a conversation that generation has been engaged with. And I'm not blaming, I'm just naming. So that's a major shift. The second major thing that I heard, and I can't even tell you how often I heard from parents regularly, my child is really uncomfortable. Whether that's because of threats, because of the way in which they're hearing things, whether it's because the way comments are being made in real life and on social. And the parents said to me regularly, I just want my kid to be comfortable. Now, obviously, if it's a physical threat, violence, you have to contact the appropriate authorities, obviously. But part of this is helping the parents and the kids understand that comfort is not a value in Jewish life, not a thing. And so we have to build up our resiliency tank to understand how to navigate this really difficult issue and lean into that discomfort. And for some, that is very hard to do, These were not the conversations parents were having, not just at Shabbat dinner, but in the car, hanging out with their kids. And it now has been outsourced to a handful of organizations, either in our community or elsewhere, to help our students think about, our kids think about, and our parents weren't in the driver's seat for that. And I liken it to the conversation about sex and drugs. I don't know a parent today who wouldn't talk to their child about sex and drugs, and yet we're not talking to our children about anti-Semitism or Israel, and we expect them to be able to navigate this on their own. And I think it's the wrong expectation. So I think that shift has been very, very serious over the last several decades, and it has left parents ill-equipped to engage in that conversation.
Got it. I'm curious, so like that's how you talk to the parents. I want to talk about how do we talk to teens and young adults about this? And this is the word that you used in characterizing that jumped out at me is the question of identity. And you talk about how, and I would say, I think we have made a mistake, and I don't think this is like in one generation. This is probably a mistake that goes back a solid 200 years in Western society of positioning Jewish identity as religion primarily, and by extension in Enlightenment conversation, part of our private space and not our public space. And that's like the whole sort of narrative shift in sort of the liberal Protestant ideal of we can be Protestants and Catholics and also Jews, as long as it's a private religious identity. And then in public, we have something else. And probably the most extreme example of that is probably France today in terms of their public approach to religion. And, the US version is somewhat different, but it definitely presupposes Judaism as religion.
That's right.
And what we also have is this rise of identity in all aspects of our life. And we all do it. We all have it. Whether it's LGBTQ or people of color or Jewish or, any kind of whatever part of who I am that both gives me meaning about sort of my understanding of myself in the world, and including gives me meaning in terms of who else is sort of my tribe. And I guess what I'm getting at is for a lot of younger Jewish Americans, and even that sort of like American Jews or Jewish Americans is an identity question, are grappling with multiple identities. And this Jewish component is being forced into sort of competition with other identities. And I'm very curious, as you're helping these parents and as you talk to kids, how do you talk to these teens about identity and how to hold Jewish identity in that larger society?
I think it's an excellent question, Jeremy. I'm going to give you the metaphor that I try to use as often as possible. We're all very adept to a degree with technology these days. And at any given moment, you have however many windows or tabs open, right, on your screen. The operating system is the same, though. The operating system to run that machine has to stay the same, even though you can minimize and maximize any window at any point in time. That operating system for me needs to be a Jewish operating system. It needs to be our particularism. And then that particularism will inform how we engage with whichever window, quote unquote, identity is open at any given moment, whether it's around gender, whether it's around sexuality, whether it's around political activism, whether it's around environmentalism, whatever it is. But I want the operating system to be deeply rooted in Jewish particularism for the Jews, while knowing fully that those windows are universalism and they should be in a healthy, tenuous relationship with one another. But here's the challenge. Jewish particularism has not been elevated, labeled as a positive, seen as a positive, and identified clearly by a variety of individuals in our community, and the younger you go, the generation itself, as being the dominant operating system. Part of the American Jewish experience, to some degree, has elevated universalism at the expense of particularism. Now you see the irony here because you already named it, meaning Gender studies is very clear about your particularism. Women's studies, very clear about your particularism. African American studies, very clear about your particularism. Not the same for Jews. And part of this does go back to the university when you think about the rise of area studies in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and the way area studies has constructed a sense of that particularism. And Jews do not see themselves in that same category. They are for the universal, and their particularism fits in where it may fit in. I want to change that. I think we have to change that. I think that's part of what Jewish education should be thinking about. And it's not because I don't care about universalism. We deeply care as Jews about universalism, right? I mean, it is a part of the DNA, right? Genesis, we are created in the image of God. All human beings are created in the image of God, not just Jews, right? So I want that healthy particularism and universalism relationship. I believe deeply in that. And I think we have to help name that for our younger people. The other thing is we see all the time among young people how they elevate and laud, quote unquote, authentic communities. How are Jews not part of that authentic identity, right? We speak the Aboriginal language. We have a connection to an Aboriginal territory. We are indigenous to a particular place, right? So like there is something to that, to our text that should help be a compelling narrative. And if it's not, then we're doing something wrong. And at the same time, we know we have a responsibility to the ger, to the stranger, because we have been strangers in a strange land. So for me, those things are deeply interconnected, but I'm not afraid of tribalism and particularism because I don't put narrow blinders on to think of it in a way that's jingoistic and chauvinistic. I actually think, and it's Leon Wiesel's here, and I don't want to butcher his quote here, but he had this incredible, quote that he had during a commencement speech, actually at Hebrew College many moons ago. And when she says, it's only in your particularism that you can understand the universal. It's only in your particular suffering that you can understand the universal suffering. So otherwise it's this theoretical abstraction. So that's one. I want to say two more things about what I say to teens, but also to parents, because it really is important. We have to label the ways in which Jew hatred have transformed over time and from where they come, right? So Jew hatred has targeted Jews because of their religion, Judeophobia. That shifts then to Jews as a people, and you see that most clearly in 19th century Europe, and you definitely see that during the atrocities of the Holocaust. It also is clearly then another shift around the perception of Israel and Zionism and Jews who identify as part of that collective. Now, we could get into a slippery slope conversation and we can have that conversation. Is it anti-Israel? Is it anti-Zionism? But the reality is that when what we saw in May, both in real life, whether it was on the boulevard in LA, the streets of New York, whether or not it was on social, nobody stood there and said, can we have a nuanced conversation about where the green line should be? Did you vote for Netanyahu? Do you like his policies or not? It was, I'm looking for Jews because Jews are going to be held responsible for Israeli behavior and Israeli action. Period. That's a form of anti-Semitism in my mind. So we have anti-Semitism coming, hard right. We know what that is. We can label it. It's part of the American history. We feel more comfortable talking about it, to be honest. We have anti-Semitism coming from the hard left, much harder for many to talk about, more insidious, less obvious to label. And we have anti-Semitism coming from within radical Islamism and some of the organizations who are deeply connected to Muslim Brotherhood theology. The minute we can't identify all of these is the minute we politicize anti-Semitism. I feel very strongly about that. So the second thing I say to all these folks is, right, who I'm teaching or I'm spending time with is, you got to educate yourself on the transformation of Jew hatred and these different means through which they express themselves and the individuals or the organizations from where it is coming. The third thing is, how do you respond? And I would argue, and it's a larger conversation, but I would argue there have to be two different types of approaches, and context really matters. There are moments in which it's a call-in approach, and a moment in which it is a call out approach. And you, Jeremy, you know this so well, right? In the work that you do with, community relations, there are times in which people are truly ignorant and you have to help educate them. And it's not because they hate all Jews and it's insidious and nefarious. They legit don't know. So we have to help them learn. Everyone doesn't know this stuff. And there are times when you have to denounce it for what it is, because you would automatically denounce it if it was targeting any other community. And you can't be afraid to denounce it because you're nervous about what that would make you look like standing up for your particularism. And there are, of course, different tactics to do both of those things.
So you've covered a lot of ground. Not surprised. I know you well. We could probably spend 3 hours just unpacking and teasing out every aspect of what you just said. I do want to come back to one particular element because I think it bears illuminating. And I'm thinking about this specifically in the context of us, you and I, talking to other liberal and progressive Jews who struggle with some of this language and such. This identity question. And yep. I think I know you well enough. You're not suggesting that identity is a bad thing, or that particularism is a bad thing, or that, say, feminism or being a proud member of a people of color caucus or an LGBTQ group is a bad thing. Nope. I think what you're suggesting, and I want to just make it really explicit, is that one of those identities that needs to be valued equally, that needs to be valued in our society. I'm not talking about by Jews. I'm talking about, I hear you have a message for young Jews about the prism, and I love that metaphor of the browser, that the prism of engaging with the world through Jewish identity. But one of the lenses for our society is the equalizing of Jewish identity with other identities in a way that it is dismissed. And I think that's what you're saying. I want to check in on that because I want to make sure our audience understands. Right now, and this is always something you and I have not actually talked about. I've been really pushing, encouraging people to read David Badiel's new book, Jews Don't Count.
Yep.
Which I know he wrote it in sort of a British context, which had a real problem, and then he recently sort of redid some of it to help it be more accessible to an American context. I think he's interesting because he self-declares as a non-Zionist. I forget if he says communist or socialist British Jew, who has a clear analysis of the idea that in these spaces, Jews don't count in the way that these other phobias and antis count. And I think that's what you're getting at. And I would encourage people to, if they want to access that from a clearly progressive voice, to read his book, Jews Don't Count. But am I right? That's what you're getting at?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Meaning, I'll give you just a very concrete example that's both related to the progressive space and shows how this plays out in terms of Jew hatred. When the student group, not the administration, from 2 different universities for Students Against Sexual Assault, put forth platforms on social during and right after, in the wake of the May 2021 conflict between Israel and Hamas, that says Jews are not welcome, Zionists are not welcome to be part of Students Against Sexual Assault because they support the IDF, which uses sexual assault in order to oppress and harm Palestinians. Huh? Right?
Right.
But what's happening there? To me, that's, and Badiel, is very clear about this, even as someone who's identified as a non-Zionist. He's like, that's anti-Semitism, guys, because you've completely stereotyped an entire people and you're excluding them because of their identity or supposed identity. And you're making clear assumptions that, really sound similar to blood libel. Remember that from early Christianity? Right? These are all connected. So this is where I would say, yes, Jews are a particular group, and just fill in the blank. If that said any other group identity, we would be up in arms as a people. We'd say that's unacceptable to target a community like that. And yet, Students Against Sexual Assault at these 2 campuses got away with it pretty unscathed.
And I would just underscore that I don't think this is a new thing. I think I've told you, I mean, I know I've shared with this audience in some of my writing recently. I had an experience myself in college of being expelled from a Latino student association because I refused to renounce any connection with just the idea of a Jewish state. And I was like, I don't know what the hell, this is back in 1991, the idea that I believed in supporting a Jewish state as part of my Jewish identity somehow diminished the fact that I'm a Mexican American, but sure. And that was the debate. What is interesting about that is that some of those same actors who were involved in that particular fight in 1991 are still managing to expel or challenge Jewish professors, academics, and others today. I see them, 30 years later. So like these things don't go away. They just come out into the public space in a more explicit way than they were. And I think we're more aware of it. I mean, I was a college kid and like we didn't have Twitter. And we didn't have like Facebook. I mean, the ADL regional office in New York was great in supporting me at the time when I was dealing with some of these challenges, but like it didn't become like something that like every activist around the country was aware of. It's a lot of this is about awareness now. I want to pivot a little bit. You talk about calling in and calling out and the role of JCRC, and I'm trying to keep my eye on all of the questions, and there are a lot of questions here. We're pulling some of them, but I want to talk practically because a lot of the folks who are here are involved in community relations. Either they're involved in JCRC, they're involved in other organizations. And there's a sort of question of what the role of relationships is with other faith communities in connecting with allies and accomplices. And we were talking before we came on, I'm very proud of the fact we did an event here less than 2 weeks ago on part of the Hanukkah Shine a Light on Antisemitism. And it was powerful to have Mayor Wu, it was powerful to have Christian leaders at the New England Holocaust Memorial really standing up on anti-Semitism. And we were just talking before this call about how the head of the Mass Council of Churches really stood up and said, this is a Christian problem. It's not on our Jewish colleagues and partners who are our allies on many things. And she did note that her Jewish colleagues are allies on many issues, but she said, this is a Christian problem. This is for us to deal with. So I'm curious, I said to you before this, like, look, that, this, we know each other, we know this work. That didn't happen just because we called somebody up and said, please, please, please come denounce anti-Semitism. They came through years of conversations and relationship building. So from your perspective, knowing that we are the Jewish Community Relations Council, what would you say to this audience about relationship building? And in particular, because we've also sort of thrown out a lot of different, we've talked about feminism and LGBTQ community, you've referenced the particular problem of, say, radical Islamists. I've referenced the experience that going on in New York of like the African Americans community there's been some challenge there in New York that we all are aware of. How might these approaches differ based on which community we're interacting with as a partner?
Look, I mean, first of all, we have to understand the influence of ideas within each of those communities to understand how they harbor or potentially harbor some of these anti-Semitic beliefs. So for example, we have to be able to talk about the influence of Farrakhan within the African-American community, and we can't pretend otherwise. That's not comfortable for many of us to do, but we have to do it. Just like when we're thinking about the Hispanic community, we have to understand more traditional Christian theology to understand it. This also goes not just within religious communities, but as you know so well, when we're talking to conservative little c, right? When we're talking to more progressive or liberal, right, communities, we have to understand where they're entering that conversation and what they're bringing from that anti-Semitic trope historically into that conversation so that we can meet them where they are. But ideally, it's not someone from outside that community who's trying to influence them. Meaning, I'm going to have much more success if I talk to people with whom I already share similar interests, identity, political agendas, whatever it may be, because I'm part of that camp. I'm part of that community. So if I'm just shooting the bow across the aisle, I don't think that's helpful because I'm just pointing a finger and they're going to look at me and say, who are you? You're not even sharing the same interests. I need people within that community. And that's hard because you have to stand up to your friends. You have to stand up to your colleagues. And stand up doesn't have to be, confrontational, but you have to be like, hey, hold on. I'm really concerned about what you're saying, and here's why. And you know how much I care about the same shared interest that you have. And if we're talking about this issue in this way, in this particular community, that poses a problem. And let me tell you why. And that's not just to me as a Jew, but it's to your Jewish constituents, it's to your Jewish members, it's to, right, so on and so forth. But I have to do it within my own community. And unfortunately, we have very, very poor models on the national scene of how to do this, because we see politically people would much rather shoot across the aisle than actually take the time that they need to take and prioritize the conversation that needs to happen within their own particular group, identity, community, political camp, whatever it is. That actually requires a lot of courage. It shouldn't, and yet it does, because we are living in a cancel culture. And we are also living in a moment in time in which we are all about the herd mentality. And the second we start to raise our hand and say, can we hit the timeout button? Can we hit pause? Can we question this? Let's ask, like, why are you saying this? What's the motivation? What are you actually, trying to do here? That's actually potentially going to get you out of the group. And people are terrified of that, personally and professionally, Jeremy. They're terrified. Now, it's highly problematic that they're terrified, but your job in many ways is to help support those people so they have the courage to do it.
Right.
And I think many of these organizations that are joining us today, because we need them to provide the encouragement, the empowerment to those individuals and tell them, you're not going to get canceled. And even if they cancel you, you're not canceled by us.
Right.
That's hard. And we have very, very divisive politics. People respond with deep emotional gut responses. They're not thinking slow cognitively. It's just the think fast. And it's very polarizing at the end of the day. And they're not able to just hit that pause button because people want immediate action. But you got to take the time to build those relationships and cultivate them and actually understand why people hold the positions they hold, so that you can come with the right education and the right framing and the right messaging to ultimately help bolster them to actually have those conversations within the communities that they need to have.
So we're coming up on the end of our hour, and I feel like we could talk for another hour, but I want to sort of dial in on 2 points that you've made that matter a lot to me. One of which is this real problem with calling out anti-Semitism when it also confirms your own partisan sort of interests. And you said it differently, but I will say it that way and say that one of my great frustrations, and I say this as someone who organizes and worked with an incredibly wide variety of Jewish organizations with very different ideological and social bents to them, that it challenges and frustrates me when I see our most conservative members who have genuine credibility in conservative circles only calling out anti-Semitism on the far left, and some of our most progressive organizations who have genuine credibility on the left only calling out anti-Semitism on the far right. And it is both I think a challenge because the call out is coming from someone who lacks credibility in the audience being called out. And to something else, and I'm going to connect to something else you said, the person doing the call out or the organization doing the call out doesn't even speak the language. It's not just have credibility, but the frames, the sort of worldview of a progressive organization calling out a conservative or something anti-Semitic just don't match up with the way that other conservatives are having that conversation in a conservative space and vice versa. And I just think that's a really important point that I really want our members to keep sitting with and thinking about, which is the place to do it. And we will always have your back as a community is when you call out and speak up about anti-Semitism in your sort of socially close spaces. The second thing, and I think this connection here is because talked about a lot of different communities. We've talked about a lot of different language. I want to come back to something you said early on in this talk about what is anti-Semitism. And like, I don't want to put it on people that, oh, in order for me to be an effective Jew calling out anti-Semitism, I now have to learn Christian conservative theology, and I have to learn progressive academic lingo, and like I have to become an expert in 17 things. Like that's a lot to put on every one of us who just wants to know, what do I do when my kid comes home from high school and has a story that's disturbing? You use the word conspiracy theory. So I want to come back to that in our final minutes and just check in, like, can we make this really simple, both for us as Jews as we talk about this, and for our friends, many of whom are with us today, about like, can we, is like, there are lots of ways this shows up, but at the end of the day, all of them boil down to a conspiracy theory perception in our civilization, in which whatever is going on, from whatever perspective, somehow Jews are responsible, Jews get blamed. Is that an accurate summarizing of all these different things? Or tell me I'm wrong, or if I'm missing something, but I want to give people a tool to hold on to when they walk away from this.
Yeah, and this may not be accepted, Jeremy, and you
Okay.
may have a problem with it too, but here's what I say. For me, it's a very simple definition of anti-Semitism. I 100% think it's a conspiracy theory. And I think anti-Semitism is the ultimate desire to either eliminate Jews physically or in terms of their identity, based upon Judaism, Jews, and Israel or Zionism, period. So either you want to eliminate physically that, or the erasure of the identity of those. And that's the desired end goal of anti-Semitism. And all of it uses conspiracy theory to make it remain resonant and relevant in changing societies. So that's why the Jew can be the corrupt communist, right? And the greedy capitalist. We can be all things to any of these organizations. And I just have to say, because I love history, this isn't new. It's not new, right? When we saw in the Russian Empire and then in the Soviet Union, it wasn't about Jews anymore, it was about Zionists. That was done purposefully, right? It becomes politically incorrect to talk about Jews that way, but you can talk about Zionists that way. When Wilhelm Marr in the 19th century in Germany changes the term from Judenhass, Jew hatred, to Antisemitumus, it's politically advantageous to do so. Because now it's not just like hatred of Jews, that sounds crass. It's anti-Semitism. So I actually am a big proponent of get rid of the word anti-Semitism and say what it is. It's hatred of Jews or Jew hatred. It's very clear when you say that. Otherwise, it's not clear to many. And understand that it is that desire to eliminate physically or erasure of identity. So that's how I hold on to it. And I just want to say one thing. I know we have to go, so don't kill me. Here's the one thing.
Sure.
I actually say, yes, you don't need to become expert in, but you better actually invest in prioritizing some education around it. Because if you expect others to be able to stand up for you, then you better be able to articulate what it is, how it presents itself, and why it matters to you as a Jew, because no one else can do that for you, which means you need to put in some real education. You need to prioritize and invest in learning. And that's on us. That's our responsibility.
Well, I think that's an excellent place. And you actually answered my last question I was going to go to, which was like your preferred terminology. So thank you for that. And I'm always comfortable with, you having a slightly different sort of like the one sentence for me. I know that's part of our, we each have one sentence, and yours is of course better than mine. But I agree with you. It's like, do the work. So let me ask you as a final question on this very simple thing is we have to do the work. I threw out a book that came out this summer. Do you have one thing that you would recommend as a whether it's a book or it's a blog or it's someone to pay attention to that you find like this is my go-to making sense of this on a week-to-week basis, or that's helping me right now to do the work? And I'll ask you as because this is the final question, this is an opportunity also, and tell us exactly maybe a little bit of what you're doing now in this new think and action tank.
Yes. So I don't like to read just one or listen to one thing. It's counter to who I am. I want to confuse myself. I want to engage with the complexity. I want to hear multiple perspectives. So I really do read across, right, the spectrum of ideas. So I can't give you just one. And I listen to the spectrum of positions. And I think that's really important. I really do. And, I don't want to be labeled, oh, you listen to this one because that's the right wing hawk, or this one, oh, that's so. We live in a world in which we all have these multiple identities, and we are not black and white, and things are not bifurcated. And we have to get out of that mindset. So I actually say expose yourself to as much as possible, ranging from, if it's the Ruth Weiss to the Deborah Lipstadt to the Barry Weiss to the David Bedell to the old school, more academic sources like, Alvin Rosenfeld. I mean, you have to look at all of this. You really do. So I think that's part of our responsibility.
Do the work.
That's right. Do the work. And I actually say, like, read the primary sources, right? Read what Hamas says. That's radical Islamism. Read what the Muslim Brotherhood says. It's radical Islamism. Also, read what the church was saying before the Second Vatican Council. It matters, right? It matters. So yes, do the work. The second question.
Just like 2 sentences of like what you're doing now.
Yep. So I am very excited to launch a new initiative with a close colleague. Many of your listeners know Aviva Klompis. She's amazing. And the new organization is called Boundless. And the work of Boundless is really to think and to engage in action around reimagining Israel education, but also where Israel and anti-Semitism intersect, and to help Jewish communal professionals in the field be able to think about these issues, train themselves to be able to navigate it for the variety of end users with whom they have to engage. And ultimately, long-term, to be able to identify language and how language has been weaponized in order to criminalize the association with Jews and Zionism in Israel, and to rethink that language to engage in a broader conversation with different audiences.
Well, thank you for that. I'm really excited to see where that goes. And I imagine we will be having you and Aviva back in other formats to talk about some of that work and to work with us on some of that as we move forward. So I'm really just like, Rachel, it's great to see you. And it was great to have an excuse to make some time to catch up with you over the last week or so and have this conversation. I just want to thank everybody for being here, and to thank you, Dr. Fish, for sharing your critical work with us today. You can learn more about JCRC's work and role in addressing anti-Semitism, particularly in the community relations space, by visiting our website. We'll throw a link in the chat. And before we go, just say thank you again to everybody for being here. We're starting a new series next week, and we invite you all to participate. It's called The Story of Our Community. I'll be sitting down with colleagues who are the regional and local professionals of our member organizations that make up the JCRC Council to really showcase the breadth of our community, to learn about the diversity of our members, and lift up the valuable work being achieved by the entire network of Jewish organizations across Greater Boston. And our first conversation will be at noon on December 21st with Dalit Horn, the new executive director of the Vilna Shul in Boston. For more information and registration, go to our website, and we'll include the link to that as well in the follow-up email. Again, my thanks to my friend and colleague, Dr. Rachel Fish, for your time and for your wisdom.
Thank you.